Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. So you will be joining in listening mode, and we do ask that you submit any questions or input using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We will try to answer some as we go along, but we are very conscious of time with this being a lunch and learn session. As we go, you'll see we've got some interactive polls throughout the session for you to respond to. And we'd just like to confirm that we will be recording this session and we will circulate that afterwards. So with housekeeping out of the way, we'll move to some introductions. Whilst we're doing that, you will see the first of our polls come up, just asking a little more detail around your role. So I'll kick us off with introductions. I'm Amy. I'm a category buyer here at YPO within our HR services category. I manage several of our service-based frameworks, and I've previously worked in local authority procurement team. So my undergraduate studies were in law, which I've been following the procurement reforms post-Brexit from both an academic and a professional viewpoint. So I'm here today to give insight and perspective from the view of a buyer. Raoul, pass to you.
Yeah, hi everybody. My name is Raoul Robinson. I am the contracts manager at YPO, and I oversee legal and compliance for the business, which for the purpose of today's discussion is a responsibility for embedding procurement regulations and best practice into YPO tender processes. I've been following the developments around the procurement reform extremely closely. I also wrote YPO's response to the Green Paper on procurement reform, and I'm currently neck deep in reviewing the new procurement bill, which means hopefully I will be able to bring some insight onto operational considerations to the table today, and saving the best until last. Jill.
Hi, everybody. I'm not sure I can live up to that, Raoul, actually. So my name is Gillian Askew. I am a procurement professional by trade. So I'm nearly 30 years into procurement. I'm a fellow of SIPS. And I also responded to the consultation event through the Federation of Small Businesses, but also through SIPS and through my own business. I'm currently director of an organisation called Go4Growth, and we're a market development organisation using evidence-based intelligence to support the marketplace, and specifically micro, small and voluntary sector providers to navigate the public procurement processes. So the new regulatory environment is important to me, both as a procurement professional, but also as an organisation supporting providers to be able to take part.
So before we actually move on to the agenda, I did just want to outline a little bit about why we're hosting the session today. So I think we're all aware that the changes to the regulations have been expected now for some time. We've seen the relevant papers and, as we're all touched on, even the draft bill in respect of this. But I think a lot of the Green Paper mentioned unleashing procurement, and YPO and Go4Growth recognise that we've got this platform where we can open up discussions and thought sharing. So hopefully you will leave the session today with some insight into what we and other procurement colleagues think the impacts of the regulations will be, as well as, I think, the opportunity that they present to us. So looking at the agenda, we've created 3 key questions for discussion. So the first one being, where are we now? So what processes are we currently following, and considering what the proposed changes are and how we can prepare for these? The impact of MAT. So we've seen the proposed change of meat to MAT, but practically, what do we feel this means? And then finally, we'll be looking at 3 procurement processes and considering what they are and how this might change business interaction. I think we just want to note as well that I think whilst the 3 of us would quite happily chat about this for hours, we've only got 30 minutes, so we will be speaking at a top level. So I'll pass to you, Raoul, to kick this discussion off around where we are now.
Yeah, sure. So we'll start with current practices. I suspect, given the audience, this is going to be fairly familiar to all, but things right now are not too radically different to how we've been working for the last 10 or so years. I suppose the most radical changes we've really seen since we left the EU has been the introduction of the Finder Tender Service, which replaces the official journal of the European Union, as well as the introduction of the National Procurement Policy Statement, which is a name that I always get wrong unless I write it down. So I've got it in big letters right in front of me because I always get it wrong, which sets out government priorities for public procurement, which included in its last publication, which was now, I cannot believe it was this long ago, but June 2021, which was social value, commercial delivery, and skills and capability development. And I think overall, so far, the transition, the changes that we've got at the moment have been pretty smooth from a procurement compliance perspective. I'm kind of interested to know, Amy and Jill, if there's anything you've kind of noticed in terms of road bumps so far, in terms of anything that's changed, because from my end and where I've been sitting, it's been fairly smooth smooth running since we left Europe in terms of procurement practices in particular.
I think I would agree with that. I think maybe there's been a little bit of confusion with the find a tender service and notices and where to find them, perhaps from supplier perspective. But yeah, I would agree. Things have the status quo has been maintained from my perspective.
And I think from provider feedback, I think largely that is the same. I think the find a tender service versus ODU was a little confusing to start with, but I think providers are wrapping their head around FTS now as opposed to ODU. Some of the changes that are not necessarily linked to the procurement regulations, but some of the recent changes to the thresholds, and the thresholds being inclusive of VAT, but actually advertised excluding VAT. And so, what are providers looking for? What do procurement actually have to advertise can be a little confusing. And with all of this stuff, I think for the provider market, it's about the communication of instructions and support that goes with these things, that if we get that right, then actually, that smooth transition should continue in the future, hopefully.
Yeah, I think they're fair observations, particularly the VAT thing. It took us a quick minute to kind of realize, and I don't think it was announced straight away that change was there. It was just embedded, and it took a second to read it and realize it was there. So I think that is a really good point. The only other thing I could think of was around the NPPS, which was intended to cover the period up to the end of the last Parliament. And we've not had any official word yet on an update to that statement. I don't think they officially have to change it every time there's a new Parliament. I think they have the option of changing it, but I think the intent was that they would at least announce whether it was continuing on or whether they were going to be making any changes. So we're still waiting on something from that end. And also, I reckon sort of some of the statements that have been made by some ministers sort of contradict that policy direction in the NPPS, but I think they're fairly minor considerations in terms of what's changed now and in terms of difficulties that have been created. I think it's been pretty smooth running so far. But what I'd like to do now, if it's okay, I'm going to move on to kind of what is changing in the future if this bill gets passed into law. And my personal view is I think if you look at the Green Paper and you look at the bill, which is currently sitting at around 114 pages, I want to say off the top of my head, I think looking at it practically, the mandated changes that are coming with the reform aren't quite as substantial as they might appear to be on the surface, because I've been thinking about it, and what I'm looking at is essentially we're still going to be applying thresholds to our procurements, and we're still going to be advertising opportunities on e-tendering platforms, still using external publications like Find a Tender. We're still going to be using award criteria. We're still going to be applying principles to our procurements like fairness and non-discrimination, amongst other things. And I think when you look at it from that angle, I think procurement processes themselves don't have to change radically to make them fit within the new regulatory regime. But what I think the Cabinet Office has done with the procurement reform work that they have done and within the bill is unlock the potential for change by deregulating on some key areas, as well as making some ambitious plans that could make processes easier. And I've just kind of listed a couple of those things off, which was firstly the promise of the centralized digital platform and the adoption of the open contract data standard, which increases transparency within the processes. And that includes things like using a centralized debarment list of suppliers who can't supply to the public sector, the supply of evaluation notes to bidders so that they understand how we reach our decisions, and the publication of contract change notice too. So I would say, though, on this specific point, I have read through the bill twice now. I cannot find specific reference in there at the moment within the bill that says any mention or use of a platform. It refers a lot to obligations around publishing the information that were contained in the Green Paper, but not where. There's also no reference in there to Contracts Finder or Find a Tender. So what I'm thinking at the moment in terms of that digital platform is essentially, if it's not in the bill now, I think we can expect those kind of details to come as a PPN possibly, or maybe a secondary legislation. It may also indicate maybe the platform might not be ready when the rules switch over, but that is just speculation on my part. Just moving on, I kind of want to cover off a couple of other things as well, if I can. The creation of the new procurement review unit to review procurement breaches is also a change, although it does feel from the follow-up to the Green Paper that remit seems to have been cut down a little bit to levels similarly offered by the PPRS, although the way that you seem to refer things to this new unit seems to be through the government itself or by work they're doing looking at what we're publishing. They're also introducing the most advantageous tender, over most economically advantageous tenders, and we're going to talk about that shortly, so I'm not going to go into that in any detail. And the same for the procurement processes themselves. They are also changing, but I don't want to discuss those in too much detail here either, because we're going to cover those off shortly too. And the final thing I kind of wanted to cover off in terms of changes that are coming is around transparency and emphasis on processes for fair payments all the way through the supply chains. And it's something personally I often overlook, because my involvement is at the procurement process stage. It's in developing tenders and putting things out that way. I don't spend that much time working at the back end of the process, at the back end of the cycle when people need to get paid. But there was a lot of emphasis in the green paper around how supply chains are being paid and support for people further in the supply chain to get paid on a much more efficient basis. Now, with what they were proposing in the green paper itself, there was a risk that contracting authorities are going to have to spend a considerable amount of time policing payment practices throughout the supply chains. But I think overall, it's good for the organizations who need the support the most. And it also reduces the amount of support those organizations need from the PRU or the PPRS to get payments processed. The other thing I would point out again, from the bill, it does feel like half the job has been done so far. So what the bill does is contain implied terms for contracts and subcontracts and requirements around payment compliance notices, which I still personally need to get my head around before I can discuss in any detail. But it's definitely a step forward, but not all of the agreed amendments seem to be in the bill yet. And that includes things like access to the contracting authority by subcontractors to escalate issues around payments, or specific rights to allow contracting authorities themselves to review payment performance further down in the supply chain. And those do seem to be kind of missing from the bill at the moment. What I would say is, despite my initial impressions that the changes aren't substantial in terms of how far they could have been for day-to-day delivery purposes, one of the common things I have heard through my journeys and discussions is that although the increase in transparency is welcome, there is some trepidation that the admin burden will also increase alongside this transparency, and that could make the procurement process itself more bureaucratic than it's ever been. Now, the government or the Cabinet Office did highlight that in their response paper. They have limited that potential through setting a £2 million limit before some of these transparency requirements become mandated. But I would kind of highlight on the other side of that, we essentially now have particular thresholds for when different types of procurements are affected by the rules. And we also have a separate set of thresholds at which point certain admin obligations begin. So I've kind of been asking myself a little bit when I've been reviewing the bill, just how simplified the new regulations are going to be with those carve-outs. And kind of before we move on to anything else, I was kind of wondering if there's anything, Amy or Jill, that you were thinking might make a big difference to how we operate on our procurements under the new regime that I might have missed off, or anything you'd disagree with?
To jump in, sorry Jill, I think actually it's an interesting point around the supplier payments. So I haven't read the bill, I'll confess, but having read the papers and the response back from the government on that, it is a really key point. And I think you do kind of have that moment when you read it and think, actually, as a procurement professional, have I given this enough consideration? And I think that that is probably a point that we can take away now as a profession and say, okay, this is an issue that's been identified to us in the practices that we're going to be using over the next 12, 18, however many months until the bill comes into place. What can we do differently? So I think it's a nice point to spark some thoughts and hopefully some changes. Jill?
And so one of the things that I saw in the green paper, which I'm keen to know how it ended up in the bill actually, because it was a bit, dare I say, inconclusive in the post-consultation response, was around feedback from tenders for providers. It's one of those key learning areas for bidders in terms of, actually, if you're not winning, why aren't you winning, and what can you do to strengthen your capability going forward? And it was, I think there was a lot of pushback, not just from the provider market, and in the consultation, I think it was pretty evenly split between procurement profession and provider market. But I think also procurement professionals said that feedback loop is super important. So I'm keen to get stuck into the bill to see what we end up with in terms of that feedback, close that loop. I know it's where some of the challenge can come from a procurement perspective, but it's such an important process. I hope it doesn't get lost in the bill. I think we might have a couple of questions if we want to check in with Lauren before we move on.
Hello. So the only actual question is just whether VAT VE18 notices are still going to be included.
The VEETs, yeah, the VEET notice.
Raoul, I think we're going to hand that straight to you.
I cannot remember off the top of my head whether the VEET notices are staying or not. There are certainly obligations. So I kind of think of VEET notices more when you use something like a regulation 32 and you're effectively awarding directly without competition, and you'd issue a VEET notice at that point to issue a notice. Can you still hear me? Am I still there?
I lost you a little bit there, Raoul.
I think my speakers just switched over. Have you still got? Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So I think I don't think they will survive as VEET notices, but there is going to be obligations still to publish notices on the basis of which you would have issued them through VEET. If anything, the amount of notices we're going to have to publish is going to increase rather than reduce. So I suspect, although they are not called VEETs, the essence or the spirit of what is a VEET still exists under the new regime.
I think that's an important point as well, isn't it? Really around that, yes, we will have to post more notices, but actually what impact is that going to have for suppliers? It's going to increase our engagement with them, and it will probably only be a positive thing, although we do know we have resourcing troubles across the public sector. I've just have a few points then around what I think we could potentially be doing currently as buyers, and I think it would be so easy to sit and just think, we'll just wait until the changes hit. But actually, even though they might not change our processes that much, as Raoul's touched on, from a buyer perspective, we should probably be taking steps to think about our approach to planning and to pipelines, start opening more discussions up with our providers and educating them, I think, on what they can expect from the public sector and engaging in the future, because I think we know that barriers currently exist, and now is the time to start breaking them down, because we've already touched on this unleashing procurement and the opportunities that this presents to us. If we don't start doing that work, we're going to be on the back foot when the changes come into place. I think, to me as well, we can start looking about how we're going to evaluate. What does it mean? How are we going to engage with our teams who we're supporting, if we're working in local authority or central government, and how are we going to measure the success of that procurement process at the other end? I think the paper gives a really clear indication, from my perspective at least, that value for money does not mean cheapest, and I think probably everybody on this call would agree with that, but we still look at procurement and say, okay, well, what savings did we achieve? And we use that as a measure for the success. But what about the quality that's been achieved, or the improvements for end users, or social value as well as savings? And I think now is the time for us to start having those conversations to change how we as organisations approach procurement in itself, and sort of realising the potential that it does have. We know as well we've got scope for doing some things differently now, and I think we were going to touch on reserved procurement. Jill, if you've not got anything to add to the other points just raised.
Yeah, no, I mean, you make some really good points. I think for me, the transparency agenda, think about it in a different way for me, as both as a procurement professional, but also as somebody who represents the provider market. Pipelines are, and any forward information that we can give, act as preparedness for providers, and our job in procurement is to inspire competition, right? So, and we have some tools available to us to be able to understand what the marketplace has to offer. And so reserve procurement's the PPN 1120 that came out around being able to reserve either at geographical location or specifically for small to medium enterprises. I'm still not seeing a huge amount of activity going on, and although it's under threshold as it stands at the minute, actually, it's a really good way to start to address the market and address transparency, visibility, all that fairness piece from a different perspective, and really start to get to understand what talent is out there, especially in the smaller provider market. And actually, if you look at SME, it's a big definition, isn't it? It goes up to 50 million. So it's really the micro and small end of that SME definition that things like reservation of procurements would be really useful and helpful for. I know we are tight on time, so I'm going to leave that point there, if that's okay.
Yeah, I'll move us on. I was just thinking the same thing. So I'm kicking us off on this slide. So we've got a poll here as well, and that'll be popping on your screen in a minute. And I am actually very interested to see the results and the responses to this one. I think for me as a buyer, meat to mat in a practical sense doesn't really have a big impact. We know that meat doesn't mean price only or that cheapest must win, but we know that value for money is also core to public sector procurement, and this doesn't alter that from my perspective. But what I think it does do is empower us, as procurement professionals to really work with our service areas and understand what is important to successful delivery of the contract, and to understand the market in which their requirements fall and what that market can achieve, for example, in respect of social value. I do think that proportionality will be really relevant here, and that's where the challenge may sit for procurement professionals, where we're thinking about tight budgets, and maybe there might be an uphill battle in terms of moving away from this traditional price quality evaluation that we've had. But if we take it back to the slide previously where we touched on procurement and savings and how we're measured, meat to mat is a really powerful way from my perspective of saying we need to consider again that procurement is more just savings. So the change in acronym to me highlights really an acknowledgement of what procurement can achieve. I think on this point as well, I'm quite interested to see how this flows down to organisations' contract procedure rules. I know we're thinking about above threshold procurement here, talking about the reform, but actually how might contract procedure rules be adapted to embed MAT? I think there's a really big opportunity here, and probably what we're doing is digging down really into a perspective from suppliers that cheapest wins. And again, this comes back to just changing that perspective. So I'll pass over to Roland and Jill, see what your thoughts are.
So I kind of think you've hit the nail on the head. My take on it is this. I think if you remove the word economic from the basis of an award, you've got to ask the question, does that mean you're going to see a drop in emphasis or cost of pricing and tendering? And I think much like a lot of the other changes in the regulations, it encourages a move away from cost factors. But I think in reality, as long as contracting authorities are going to be subject to budgetary constraints, price will always continue to factor in heavily into how contracts are being awarded. Maybe a little bit cynical, but what I would say on top of that is, those procurements where budgets aren't so fixed or constrained, confidence in the public sector to build more balanced procurement is possible. But I think right now, the bulk of the public contracting, even with increased factors and things like social value within our tenders, the cornerstone of what people are going to continue to look for will be the cheapest or cost-effective option. And I don't think changing the terminology is necessarily going to be what drives us away from cost-driven procurement. But I do think innovation and guidance from central government might. So I think meat to mat on its own won't make a difference. I think with support from central gov as to how it can be achieved, and a change in emphasis or feeling within the public sector could slowly make a difference in terms of what we look for on tender evaluations, but I don't think it'll be a quick change.
Yeah, and I echo all of those comments. I think in procurement, we didn't need to get lost in the word economic, actually. So value for money has been our raison d'etre forever, or it should have been at least. And so, whether that's socio-economic value or whatever, that most economically advantageous tender means, I think you're right. On its own, meat to mat might not make a huge amount of change. Providers definitely tell us in Go4Growth that it is a race to the bottom, and that, there isn't big shift in cost to quality evaluations. And I think there's a nervousness. This is taxpayers' money, so it has to be spent well. We are on the hook, we are responsible, it's highly governed and regulated, and that's absolutely as it should be. But we shouldn't be fearful of really seeking value and really driving for value and understanding what value for end users actually is. If we think about the money that we're spending in health and well-being and social care, the outcomes that we need from that public money spent is life-changing. And so cheapest will not always be best. And we shouldn't be afraid of that either as procurement professionals. But it's a debate that could rage on and will rage on, I think, ad infinitum. It's what we've talked about since the dawn of time in procurement, and we'll all die talking about it as well, I think. So it's not one we can fix today, but I think it's interesting that we've been given the ability, and we're being encouraged as procurement professionals formally through the regulations to think about value, to put value very formally into our tenders. And so if anybody was worried about that, they don't need to be worried about that anymore.
I think we probably ought to move on.
We've got 5 minutes left, haven't we?
5 minutes left. So Raoul, this is again one for you to lead on. So the 3 procedures, I'll hand to you.
5 minutes to talk about probably the biggest change in the regs. So let's look at them then. We're excluding light touch from the moment, which has been retained. We have open, limited, and competitive flexible procedures. Starting with the open, it should be very familiar to everyone. It's vanilla as procurement comes. It's a single stage procurement to anyone who wants to bid. I think the basis for retaining it under the new regulations was because it was well known within the public sector and supply market to work with, and it basically is a bit like a security blanket. It's confidence in what we know. But as we move on and get onto the flexible procedure, I would question why it needs retaining, but we'll come on to that shortly. What I would say in my reading of the bill, I'm not wholly sure it's going to work entirely as intended unless the bill is amended, because what it says in the bill is essentially about open procedures is that under Regulation 19(5) of the bill, any tender other than an open tender can exclude suppliers by reference to conditions of participation. Now, what condition of participation is a condition that a supplier must satisfy if the supplier is to be awarded a public contract. So it reads a little bit to me at the moment like that includes things like mandatory conditions. So, a requirement that a supplier make a delivery on a certain date, or that staff on site are security vetted, are conditions of participation. They're things that you must be able to deliver if you're going to be awarded the contract. Now, I don't think that was the intent of the draft, and I am providing an interpretation of what I've seen in the bill, so do take it with a pinch of salt. But I do think there's small details like this that we're going to be looking to scrutinise as that bill passes through the House. And I think it's worth highlighting now that the factors in this sort of reform is going to be difficulty in interpreting the regulations rather than actually delivering operational procurements, I think. Moving on, I'm just really conscious of time. Limited procedure is largely the retention of the current Regulation 32(2)C. That's the negotiated procedure without prior publication. Unlike the current regulations, it's not strictly treated in the new bill as a procedure. Instead, it's a justification for a direct award under Schedule 5, and as a separate part set out in the regulation of the bill for direct awards where necessary to protect life, which is a very limited set of circumstances. I would go into it in a bit more detail, but again, conscious of time, what I would say about the limited procedure as it stands, I think the test has been relaxed a little bit regarding how you interpret what is foreseeable when you kind of award these kind of contracts. But again, that will be a discussion for another day. And then finally, just leading on to probably, for me, certainly the most exciting part is the competitive flexible procedure. Now, this is the worst part of the bill for me. They haven't retained the name. It's not going to be called the competitive flexible procedure. It's going to be called, have you read this right? It's going to be called a competitive procedure that isn't an open procedure, which is just a little bit of a blasphemy. They had such a good name and they didn't use it, but there we go. But it's still one of the most exciting parts of the reform. I think it effectively removes the restrictions on how procurement can be conducted, and that unlocks unlimited potential really for innovation and improved procurement practice. I can't really describe what a procedure under that route will look like, because it could technically be anything from a 2-stage restricted procedure to a solution that has multiple stages with negotiation built in. But I would point out, I suppose, with that extreme flexibility comes the potential for suppliers having also on the other end of this to contend with huge volumes of different processes for every different contracting authority they attempt to tender with. What I would say about that, though, is I think for me, it might be a bit of an extreme outcome. I think largely, as I suggested in our green paper response, what I think will happen is we will stick in the public sector with known processes because they are familiar and they are known quantities in terms of the likelihood of things like challenges. What I think is what will happen over time is we're going to see innovations by pioneers in the industry, which we will benchmark against in the future, which will change slowly the direction of procurement. Like I say, I think that change is going to be slow. I don't think we're suddenly going to have this influx of suppliers having 20 different hoops to jump through. I think we're going to see a fairly familiar pattern of tender processes once these rules do go over. But I'm prepared to be surprised on that point. One final thing I would bring up on this, very conscious of time, I'm almost out, is back to the open procedure. I mentioned it earlier on. I'm failing to see at the moment, based on how the flexible procedure is included, why I couldn't just conduct an open process through the flexible procedure, because there's nothing restricting me from having a single open process
through that overall procedure. So why retain both? And I'll go back to my original point. I think like I say, it's just there as a comfort blanket for now, but I don't see why you couldn't run every procedure under a flexible procedure. But again, I'm hoping the government, when they produce some guidance around how it should or could work, might help sort of answer some of those questions, but it's a bit of a wait and see scenario at the moment. And that's it. That's the three procedures as they currently look under the bill.
I've just had the results of the last poll, which was how do you feel about the introduction of the competitive flexible procedure pop up on my screen, and over 80% of people who responded during this session have chosen either sceptical or apprehensive. And I think that would sum up my feelings around it as well, particularly if the upcoming guidance is unclear or best practice guidance isn't immediate, like you touched on, Raoul. It's unfortunately, I think one of those we'll just have to wait and see, even though we can probably be thinking about how we might like a procedure to look under this. I am conscious that we've gone past 12:30, so we might see a little bit of drop off. I didn't know should we just stay on for a few extra minutes to have a look at some questions?
Yeah, I'm happy to stay on if we're happy to carry on.
I've been answering questions as we've gone, so I have answered as many as I could in the Q&A for people. I think there is, Lauren, I think there is one, maybe a couple in there. So somebody has asked if we'll do a session like this on the NHS white paper. So I said we'll have a chat about that, and if it's helpful and useful, we could certainly look at it. There is a question around how do we feel the changes will impact the light touch regime that's currently in place, and I probably don't think we've got time to answer that one today, so we can answer that in slower time if that's okay for whoever posed the question. And then there is a question, sorry, I'm doing this for you, Lauren, from someone who says, will there be more sessions on these topics in more detail, which we can also have a think about in slower time. But if it's helpful for our colleagues in procurement, I'm sure we can continue to do some stuff going forward. Yeah, I think that's all the Q&A.
I think from YPO's perspective, in terms of the bill itself, I've got some grandiose plans for what I kind of want to do with it in terms of writing some papers. I plan to make those papers public, and I'm going to kind of do a couple of things. I'm going to compare them against what the government said they were going to do against what's in the bill. I'm also going to do a comparison about what will practically change under those regulations. And I'm also going to do a more critical paper around things that I think are pressing to make work. And my plan is to make all those public, so those will be available for you. And again, I kind of like this will. If we can help, if people find these dialogues useful, then I'm all game for talking more about it in the future.
There is also a question about whether we can send the slide deck out. I think we can we, Amy?
Yeah, absolutely, that's no problem.
Perfect.
Well, we'll leave it there then. Thank you everybody for joining. As we said, the recording will be circulated. And take care, enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thanks all.
Thank you, cheers.
See you later.